Okay, let's say you know your way around a bit in this game. You have a bit of an idea what to do against the central cannon, and then people play this against you. Now what? If you're somewhere around the intermediate level, you might like this video. This is the stuff that I wanted to hear myself when I started playing in this game. We're going to go through a couple of moves that I don't recommend, but share some interesting ideas about this position. We'll also get to moves that I do recommend, of course. I should give a disclaimer, this is just my opinion, it's not Xiangqi.com's. I'm not even part of Xiangqi.com, I'm a friend and a guest on their channel. And it's definitely not an opinion that I read in some book somewhere. This is my opinion as a player. But it's also the correct one. Let's take a look. Okay, so the first move that I don't recommend is developing the horse like this. Now, I've talked about a horse like this beforehand. I called it a horse being in jail. It can't move forward because this pawn is in our way. Now, that doesn't have to be the end of the world, really. There are ways of liberating the horse by getting maybe a rook over here and then pushing the pawn or so. Or, in dire necessity, use an elephant to push. But it is an element in this position that works favorable for red. The horse is not quite as happy as it could be if the pawn was still at home, and I feel that this move validates what red just did. Now, I don't mind my horse being put in jail, but what I'm not going to do in the opening is, if the jail is already there, put my horse in there for free. I want to make moves that go against what my opponent is doing. So I'm not recommending this one. Over to the next. The second move that I want to look at is a move that I used to make when I started playing this game. And it is either cannon to the middle. Now, those are not the same move, the position isn't symmetrical, and I don't value them equally. I just really hate them both for the same reason. What we'll usually find is that if we start playing a move, let's say this one, then we run into a variation from the central cannon that is a tempo down. We're essentially playing red with one tempo less, and that means that if red knows their way around against the central cannon, it's usually fairly easy to play a position very comfortably. As black, moves like this are playable, but you need to know your way around really well to understand every nook and cranny of the central cannon opening to make sure that the tempo down doesn't hurt you that much. Now, the pros can do that, but for us at intermediate level, which I presume many of you are, is a bit ambitious to do. And frankly, I think Xiangqi has way more to offer than always putting the cannon in the middle on move 1. Let's explore some of those. I want to discuss a bit of a funny gambit. It is objectively wrong, I'm not recommending it, but it might give us some inspiration on what we're going to explore later. Now, the funny gambit is shoving this pawn right into its face. Best move is to take, and black attacks the pawn again. Now, this is the kind of stuff that also in Chinese is called coffee house play. And essentially black is banking on one of two things to happen. The first thing that black is hoping for is that red is going to get greedy and try everything they can to keep the pawn on the board, or trade it off. Let's say I'm just going to make some really stupid moves, especially on the red side. Red will trade before anything bad happens. And as black, we're a pawn down here, but black won't have any trouble transitioning into the middle game. Black has much more space for all his pieces. This should be wonderful. And the other thing that black is hoping for, let me take a lot of moves back here. back to move 2, is that red is somehow familiar with the lesson of don't be too greedy, and instead they'll just freeze. Let me again make some random stupid moves. Attacking this pawn over here, black will protect. And here is the point of this elephant and horse development. We created some space for the rook. And given that the pawn is now pinned to this horse, we're going to win it back. Let me just make some random move here. I just want to show how active this rook is, and black is essentially thanking red kindly for all the work that red did pushing this pawn that is now off the board and resulted in such an active rook for black. Now, as said, this is two sides of extremes that black is hoping for, and there are ways of red to do better. But let's keep this maneuver of pushing the pawn and then collecting it with the rook in mind. It's going to come up a few other times in the video. And yes, I am foreshadowing to quite a large extent here. Moving on to the first move that I might recommend, especially if you're somewhat of a safer player and you don't want to get destroyed in the first 10-ish moves or so. It's not my favorite move in the position, and it breaks my rules of developing your major pieces first, but there is something that you can argue for this elephant development. Essentially, this is a somewhat flexible approach. We're going to go either of two ways. If red allows it, we will develop like this, and then don't we have the arrow? Please, there, thank you very much. And next, we'll be pushing this pawn in the way that we have seen before. Let me just give a brief example of stuff that could happen. So red could move the horse out like that. And let's say cannon over here because of no reason in particular. Now we push. There is a case to be made. You could to also move the rook out first and only then push the pawn. But usually in Xiangqi, if there is any kind of pawn against pawn break that works tactically, and here it does because there is a pin on the board, so this pawn isn't really going anywhere, then it is usually better to push the pawn first in this fashion. Just because it constrains red a bit in their replies. For example, if I take back a few more moves, let me go back a bit of an extra move even. I'll develop like this now. If black were to go in the exact same fashion here and first move the rook out, red has the option to react like this. And this is a bit awkward. We cannot really take because then the rook would be hanging and we're in a bit of a bind here. So as therefore stated, it is better for black to push this pawn first, and after taking, which red still doesn't have any better, the trick still works now because the pawn is pinned down towards the elephant, and we're going to take the pawn on the next move. Even if red were to develop like this, we're still going to take the pawn because our cannon is protected. Now, back to move 1, where we played the elephant. Why did I say this is safe? Well, you can already see this is a somewhat safer way of aiming for the funny gambit that we saw. If somehow red invests into the position of trying to keep black from doing that, let's say a move like this or anything, that's pretty extreme. We're definitely not going to push this pawn anymore. Now black can completely change tack and go for the pawn against pawn opening, which usually means that on move 1 both players push their random pawn. Push not the random one, this very. And this is a somewhat safer variation of the pawn against pawn opening because black already got this elephant move in. Why is that safer? Let me go into that on the next chapter. But in conclusion, this elephant move offers a bit of flexibility. We're either going for pawn against pawn or we're preparing this counter push depending on red's reaction. And in that sense, it's a fairly safe opening to play. Okay, so as promised, let us examine the pawn against pawn opening. This is one of the two most popular moves that are played, and it is very common on Grandmaster level. Now, for intermediate players, I'm actually not going to recommend this system. How to go in the reason of this. When people, as red, push this pawn, that is called a move that is quite flexible. It has such a reputation, and as such, you may think that if black responds in kind, just on the other wing, that the position is flexible. And you would be right. But the position is flexible for red. By that I mean that if red wants to fight, let's say going back to a central cannon opening like this, you're going to have to respond in kind, you're back into pretty sharp territory, or you're going to be a bit passive. But if red wants to be passive himself, or be somewhat quiet, I should say, and play the most natural move on the board, it is very natural because the horse path is already cleared on move 1. Well, as black, we're going to have to respect this. You're not going to knock red out. If red wants a passive game where both players leave each other alone, red can have it. But that doesn't mean that as black you're out of danger. For example, let's say that black responds in kind. Looks natural enough. I've seen one game in a tournament where red played this rook over here, aiming to swing across to the other wing along the second rank, or as I call it, swing low, sweet chariot. And black didn't really think anything of that and decided to follow red's lead. Now what black probably had in mind is that both rooks are going to swing over. It's pretty common in Xiangqi to happen that first elephants are connected, such that now the rook swinging over doesn't block that from happening anymore. And what we would see over here is a position in which both players concentrate a majority of their forces on one wing. They're going to develop their pieces on their own right, and they're both going to block things off on their left. Pretty common thing to see in Xiangqi, call it whatever you will, sword and shield, hammer and anvil, but you're hoping to break through on one wing sooner or later. And the opening is quiet, maybe even somewhat boring, because both players leave each other alone so much, but heck, all the pieces are still on the board, so there is plenty of potential for the game to become exciting later. And I guess this is what black roughly had in mind when he played his rook up just in the way that red did. But red has a tactic over here, and it is a move that we've kind of seen before. Having given you a few seconds to let that quote settle in, did you come up with pushing the pawn like this? If black takes, and there isn't really anything better, Now we go to collect again, and this pawn is definitely going to fall because there is a pin on the board, and black is just a fair bit slower. Now, some might wonder, can black counter push? I would say check that one with an engine, but let me just say, from chess we know that in certain positions, if as black you try to copy the player who goes first, so either red or white depending on your game, and things become tactical early on, that might not really be the best thing to go with. That's why the symmetrical English can go on for 15 moves, but I don't remember anyone saying playing 2 f5 against the King's Gambit. So, having allowed this pawn push, black made an early on mistake, and it is just a sign how even in a somewhat passive opening, like this pawn versus pawn and then developing both of the horses, red is still threatening some things. There is plenty of venom there, and black is not out of danger yet. What black should have done, instead of developing this rook, is first playing up this elephant. This achieves several things, but most of all, it protects the horse over here. So the whole tactic of pushing the pawn isn't going to work, because black can just dodge. Now, after the elephant move, given that the whole thing doesn't work, red doesn't really have much better than connecting elephants first himself. And then we are back again into the position we've seen before. Okay, I just want to conclude with this saying that I hope that this shows that even in the quiet variations, you still need to be very careful with this as black. Essentially what pawn against pawn says, if you are black, is, dear red, do your worst. I respect the move that you made on move 1, I'm even copying it, and I am ready for anything that you have, and I will outplay you later. Now that is a message that grandmasters can easily send because they are prepared. But this is the reason that I can't really recommend this to intermediate players. And with that, let me move on to my main recommendation for this video. Alright, my main recommendation for facing the pawn opening is going to be a move that was already covered in an early video by David's student Jason. And he examined the thundering cannon defense. Now, we might have seen one idea that this particular move has, and it is to push this pawn. Right, we're not interested in taking the red pawn, that wasn't the point. We're interested in what is going on behind. For example, if red were just to develop like this. Now, of course, red cannot take, because not only is this a check, but also a fork to the rook. That arrow didn't quite make it, but I hope you got the point anyway. And not only is this elephant somewhat vulnerable, but after move 1, there is also this point that we're looking at that makes developing for the red horse a bit less attractive. So that is point 1 that we might have seen in Jason's video earlier on. And there is a second point that I want to illustrate. Because what if red does something against this for that either takes the sting out of the whole tactical idea, let's say developing an elephant which both protects this spot and also puts something between the cannons, so the horse now has no problem developing over here. Or another thing that red could do is put a cannon to the middle, which gives black something more urgent to worry about, and black can't really get their tactic in yet. Well, to either of these moves, and those four are the most common ones by the way, either cannon to the middle or either elephant to the middle, I am going to recommend a single setup with maybe some extra flexibility there in baby steps sense. So what we're going to do here as black is we are going to do as we are told on beginning level and follow the main opening principles. Develop our major pieces. What we're going to do is this other cannon is going to the middle. Both horses will afterwards go to their most natural spots. And both rooks will go to the files that will soon be opened. Let me just execute it on the board actually, just to give a bit of an example. Now, what will usually happen is that you can get at least one rook developed like this. The other one doesn't always work because red already has developed over here. In such case, you will need to improvise and put it either over here or over there. But let me get rid of these arrows. But it's not uncommon for black to actually get both of the rooks in. Now, in which order should that happen? Well, that is a liberty that I'm going to leave to you. I don't want to give you a series of moves that you can just employ without thinking. I want to trigger your thinking brain and as such get you already start playing the game on move 2. I'll give you a bit of direction though. If red were to develop either of the elephants, let's say this one now, then arguably you can prioritize getting this rook out. So I'm going to move the horse to the side where it is already a bit more natural in this particular variation where red pushed his pawn. And let's say red goes here, black develops and red can go either out, protecting the cannon like that, or they can defend like this. And afterwards as black we can go for our regular plan, get the horse out, get the rook out and go to our normal way. The reason that I like prioritizing the horse is, let's say that in this particular variation red actually prefers to develop his horse this way, protecting the cannon like that. Now black has a bit more flexibility on hand because he prioritized his right wing first. Now a move that I don't quite like, putting this cannon in the middle here, because we're just attacking a pawn that is already defended twice. I don't really see much of a firepower within that. Is this other move of placing the cannon over here, which may look a bit mysterious if you've never seen this thing before, but soon we're going to develop and get one of our rooks towards the river, let's say like that, over here, and getting rid of the arrows. If we imagine a rook to be over here, now this cannon is no longer mysterious, with lots of pressure on this horse or the advisor behind it. And even if red were to recover for that tactically, which they usually will, control of this file is still a very useful instrument for black to have. So that is a reason that if we ever see an elephant going first, I would prioritize getting the rook out. On the other hand, if red pushes a cannon to the middle, well, with this going on over here, we can't really develop our horse to the edge now, right? We need to oppose this. I've never seen red taking here, and the variations will go pretty much similar as the cannon versus cannon in general. So improvise here in the same sense. Most red players will instead just develop, and we're going back to our familiar development of getting both the horses out and using at least one open file for a rook and find some solution for the other one. Now, having observed this whole system, I can imagine some advanced players going, what about developing this very cannon? Yeah, I can imagine that some more advanced players will start objecting about this repertoire, because honestly, theory doesn't think of this move as the very best reply. Instead, it would recommend pushing either elephant to the middle, which is a way of gambiting the central pawn, which might trigger a few questions. So first of all, why either elephant? Are they somewhat similar? No, they're not. They are two completely different systems. They have virtually nothing in common. Other than that, they just both happen to work and both happen to be considered the two best moves in this position. But I don't really wish to recommend it because it goes against the principles that we are learning when we're coming into this game. It's a completely different ball game, and learning so much theory about this particular variation, I think, is just going to confuse you. Instead, if we follow the recommended cannon move to the middle, on intermediate level, you're going to be fine. And I'd even reckon that on advanced level, the move is definitely playable. It's by no means easy to refute, and I think you will have much more fun sticking to this system. Now, admittedly, this is the only recommendation that I myself don't play. I do play one of these elephant moves, but I only did so later after getting into the game, and I wouldn't recommend doing this from the beginning on. I want to give a bit of a demonstration in the setup that I recommended. So let's examine that. Already went spoiling the position a bit, but let's go through it step by step. So this is a game that I had when I was not very experienced in this game yet, but I was instructed that this particular setup existed. So I moved the cannon to the middle, prioritizing in a way that I wouldn't do nowadays, but hey, this is from some time ago. There were some logical piece developments. Red avoided being attacked by the rook. Instead, I developed the horse first, and now I could move either of my rooks out. And I did both of them. And we got to the end setup of what black was aiming for. Now, what I really wanted to do is liberate my position on the right wing a bit. So I wanted to get this pawn push in. So I started preparing that by getting a rook to the river, which isn't the best move. I'll get into why. Red made some random advisor move, and such I pushed and activated my rook and also liberated several of my pieces. This horse can get out now if it so wishes, but I didn't do this in the best way, because after I pushed this rook over here, red could have offered a trade. This trade is neutral, That is to say, if I were to accept the trade, red has now wasted 3 moves that are off the board. Horse out, rook here, and horse back. And black has also wasted 3 moves. Rook out, rook halfway, and rook takes. If you didn't know beforehand, now you do, that if your rook ever makes a halfway move, then any trade is a neutral trade as far as tempo goes. But if I were to get into this position, getting this pawn move in is a little bit more difficult, and instead I might even have accepted that I need to waste a little tempo and then get my move in. Which is a bit of a detriment compared to the game that I really played. But there was a better way of doing this. Any inspiration that we might have? Okay, if you considered the question, is it possible to push this pawn right away? Congratulations, you're not a beginner anymore, definitely, and probably well beyond intermediate as well. Indeed, if red takes, which he doesn't really have any better to do, now, as I said before, it's usually good to push the pawn first and then collect with the rook if it works. And in this case, it works. The pawn cannot be defended, and with both this rook and this horse over here, it's not like the pawn can go anywhere. And on next move, it will just be taken, and this is the more accurate way of playing it. So here is something that you know now that back when I played the original game, that I'm showing as an example, didn't quite know. And that is all that I wanted to cover for my main recommendation here. It is good to remember that in this, if red ever allows us to push this pawn for tactical reasons, it's usually good and we should. But if red doesn't allow this and keeps us busy, now we're just going to say, thank you red for being so slow in developing your pieces. Now as black, we're even faster. Now this is still in the order that I played it in. I recommended getting this horse out earlier on, but I hope you get the point. Now, with this recommendation covered, there is one more thing that I briefly want to explore, and I'll see you there. The final thing that I just wanted to say is that when I learned that there are moves like this that show the disadvantage of what red did for 2 reasons. First of all, giving us this hook, and second of all, accelerating our development. Xiangqi started becoming so much more fun to play as black. Now, there might be one more move to examine that red can make, and that is moving this horse out. That looks like a move that also doesn't have any disadvantage at all. But here, as black, I'm going to give you a bit of a bonus recommendation, and that is, now we do push this pawn. Because now we have demonstrated the disadvantage of red running out with their horse in this fashion. Now, if red ever wants to go sharp and go for a central cannon move order or anything, you can just reply with whatever system you have as black against the central cannon. I can't quite think of any system in which the inclusion of this horse and this pawn is to red's advantage. Maybe in the practical sense, because it might be a position you don't know, but from an objective point, black doesn't have anything to worry about, which is why this move is also so popular. And by contrast, if red were to go into this pawn versus pawn variation, which you also see a lot, black is actually very safe here. all these dangerous things that I want you for to avoid in the pawn versus pawn are not going to happen, because this horse is standing over here. Gone are all the tactics where the cannon can exert some pressure. Gone are all these rook moves where the pawn push happens, because this horse is in the way so much. As black, you shouldn't have much trouble getting a fairly comfortable game here. And yes, I'm just going to recommend a single move here and leave the rest of the improvisation to you. Take my word for it, you're going to be okay. And with that being covered, I guess that's enough for one video take. Mind your step on the way out.